So nice to have everyone back. We had a pretty stormy chat room, I think in the best sense. And I'm not going to betray what my group was kind of wrestling with, but it sort of gives me a starting point. Angela, are you there? Can you guys want to make
sure? I was muted, but I'm here.
Okay, good. And the first thing, I guess, is just some difficulty with this language sounding like very Christian, kind of non-Jewish language. It's kind of foreign, particularly for Reform Jews, where we don't hear that idea of God loves you, or does God love us? So first, can you just help, at least for in your own prism, why is this language comfortable for you, if it is?
It is 100% all through our liturgy. The problem is a lot of it is in Hebrew, and we're just not paying attention to it. And I also think that there are ways that certain religions kind of end up getting to own certain things, and then other religions want to be defined as not that. And very early on, there was a real strong sense that Christianity use that language of God loving us and this sort of loving embrace that I think in some ways Jews went more towards this sense of rules and laws. And I mean, that's a gross generalization, but I think that we wanted to distinguish ourselves to a certain extent, and somehow it did feel like they got to have it, but it is hugely a part of our tradition. And yeah.
Why does it resonate for you through, let's stick with our tradition for now, not as personally. Can you give us, even though I know it's in your piece, just because some might not have read it, just a few of the places where that God language is really there?
So let's take just the Song of Songs, which is the love poetry of the Bible. Our rabbis, when they said, how could you put this into the Hebrew Bible? It sounds like erotic love poetry. The rabbi said, well, this is the Holy of Holies. This describes our relationship with God. And they really termed it in that sense of like, when you think of the most intimate, caring, personal relationship, that was the way they viewed the relationship of God and Israel. There is, when you say the Shema, which is like the watchword of our faith, it is surrounded by two prayers of love. The prayer before the Shema talks about how God loves us, and the prayer after the Shema talks about how we love God. And it uses that word ahava. The one before is ahavat olam, and the one after is ve'ahavta. That word ahava, love, surrounds the Shema. And I would say that the way we view love in Judaism is not so much the kind of I feel love, but more love through action, love through caring, love through telling your story, love through giving you boundaries and helping you realize your potential. I think it resonated for me because this is in many ways the way that I felt love through my own parents. And there is obviously a lot of language about God as a parent. We're about to go into the holidays where we say, Avinu Malkeinu, our parent, our king, our father, our king. A lot of us model a certain theology can be based in part by our parents. I say that right now in particular because you're not going to believe, but I went into my breakout room, which is randomly assigned, and there are like 180 people on this call, and my parents were in my breakout room. My parents are here from Tacoma. I'll just say hello to Fred and Solja. You can all say hello to Fred and Solja Warnick. We're here. But it was funny to be in the breakout room with them. I don't know if you did that on purpose, Sarah. I think it was an accident. But anyway, I would say that both my parents modeled love as unconditional, and yet there was a lot of love is also how you behave, how you walk in the world. Food was also love, I'd say, in my house.
In mine too. I want to get to that idea of unconditional love, but first let's just take the Ahavat Olam prayer, which you described to me in our interview for the forward as you really reminded me to pay attention to the fact that it's ultimately rules. Like God loves us and shows it by giving us boundaries, shows us by giving us kind of directives. And I think for those of us who live in a very kind of cafeteria style society where we don't do a lot of what we don't want to do, and we actually at this point can do it kind of when we want to do it, Judaism isn't as freeform. We actually have to kind of show up for Kol Nidre at a certain time. It's not whenever, it's not on demand the way Netflix is. And similar to the way we read or get music, like religion, and particularly Judaism, is very much about, we do things by the book. And obviously not every book is the same, but it's hard for us to see, I think for many of us, to see love language or a kind of a loving frame of those rules. So how would you help us with that?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's hard for people to imagine that rules could be a form of love, but I'd like, or even, critique as love, I guess. And there's a certain amount of that when we think about this prayer, Ahavat Olam, which is, God, you loved us so much, you gave us, and it doesn't say you gave us the world and the flowers and the trees and life. All of that's great. And God helped create all of that, let's say. But it actually says, you loved us so much, you gave us the Torah with its hukim and mishpatim, its laws and precepts. It doesn't sound like the kind of present you were hoping for out of a loving God. But I just want you to imagine whether it's a relationship with a fantastic teacher you had in your life. Like, if you felt like that teacher loved you, my guess is it's not just because the teacher always gave you A's or always said you did great, but that teacher took the time to take you aside and said, you know what? I think you could do this even more. Or here are some of the guidelines so that you could become an even better writer. That there's an investment in your growth, an investment in your full realization as a human being. And I think that's the way we think of the Torah. The Torah's got these stories which say, here's your background. This is who you are. This is your identity. These are your roots. But the Torah also says, and here is how you can be your best self. Here's how you can create the best world to live in. That to me is an incredibly, maybe the highest form of love, rather than just saying, here are all these beautiful things to just enjoy. It's
and if people say that they're looking for a love in the sense of being kind of held, or feeling like God is walking with you through a hard time, is that just kind of like modern, mushy, crunchy speak, or is that also in kind of our Jewish liturgy or language?
It's 100% all there, but I just would say it's not the only way to see it. And you can see it if you just take a look at the Psalms. You've got 150 Psalms written by presumably King David. You've got ones in there that are like that incredibly wonderful, God, you've embraced me, you've given me these beautiful things, I'm joyful, I'm having the best life. And you also see ones that say, God, I am in a pit of despair. Mima amakim, I'm in the depths, I'm crying out to you. Why are you hiding your face from me? Where have you gone? And so there is a fullness to this relationship with any person that you actually really love, whether it's a parent, a spouse, a sibling, a friend, a child. My guess is you have moments of all of that. And what I love about our tradition is it gives a fullness of a real loving relationship, which includes not just the joy and the gratitude, the unconditional love as a foundation, but also those moments of like anger and pain and crying out. And there's room for that in our tradition, because the worst thing you could have in a relationship with someone you love is to just cut it off or to not be honest with each other. So there's a lot of honesty and grit in there.
You know, I was sorry that I couldn't include in your interview, just because of space, where you talked about actually that our tradition is kind of unique in the sense that there's room to rail at God, to scream and to cry and to say, why did you do this? Why is this happening? And we're not excommunicated for it. There is no cutting off for that kind of emotion and anger. And that suggested, you said to me, relationship, that it's more real because of that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There is not only, there's that space, there's even an articulation of that language that's a part of our Hebrew Bible, so that we have it at our hands to see that this is the way it's been done. And I think that the theme that we come back to, which is hugely the theme of our high holidays coming up, is that no matter what, no matter how far you've gone, no matter how angry you get, no matter how much you rail, you can always return. Teshuvah means return, and God will always take us back. And I think right before we say our sins and say how horrible we are, the prayer we say right beforehand is Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun. God, you are merciful and gracious and slow to anger, and reminding not only ourselves, but also reminding God. And so there is this sense that we can always return, that even there's space to be angry, space to cry out. Our lives are not fair. There's a lot to be angry about. But there is this foundation we can come back to of a God that loves us and holds us and will take us back no matter what we've done.
So that gets to the unconditional idea. And you did speak beautifully about your parents, where you felt like, yes, they gave you your story and they did give you something to aspire to, but you also never felt like they would abandon you. I feel like our liturgy on the high holidays does threaten abandonment. I mean, the Unitana Tokev, basically it says you are about to get judged and there is going to be a verdict. And it depends on your prayer, it depends on your charity, it depends on your repentance, right? That feels very conditional to me, and I think to any of us who stand or sit and read it. Can you help us square the unconditionality and the conditionality of this holiday we're about to enter?
So that, you're pointing to one of the hardest theological prayers that we ever have to deal with, that Unitana Tokev prayer. And it says, yes, who's going to die by stoning, by fire, by strangling? I mean, it's so hard to hear that language, especially right now. I do not feel like what the prayer is saying is that God is just making that decision for us. I think there's a sense that these things are out of our hands. It's going to happen. Who will die in these ways? And we don't know. That line that you referred to, that prayer, teshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah, that prayer, repentance, and charity will somehow temper the decree. Makes it sound like somehow with this magical thinking of praying or repenting, we can somehow cancel the decree. Well, that's a very bad translation of that line. I want to actually point out what it really is saying. It says, if you remember singing, we sing ut teshuva, ut tefillah, ut tzedakah, ma'avirin. Ma'avirin, that word has the word ever in it, or la'avor, which means to cross over. It's the same word that is used to name the Israelites. We are called Ivrim, and the Hebrew word for Hebrew is Ivrit, if you've heard that before. So Ivrim, Israelites, or Hebrews, are the people who cross over. And they literally are talking about moments like Abraham crossing a river and becoming the first Jew, and Jacob crossing the Yabok River and he becomes Yisrael. So in a very literal way, our tradition almost always has moments of transformation as moments of crossing over. And it's often literally be crossing over a river, where we as Ivrim are boundary crossers. So take for a moment this idea that what is happening is that if you do tefillah prayer, you are transforming the decree. You're not actually able to cancel it. You're crossing over it. You're helping understand, like if you imagine that your prayer helps you understand the decree in a different way, that it's not evil, you are appreciating that things like an illness or a death are part of life, and you can think differently about what the decree is as opposed to nullifying it, that you transform that. I think that something like tzedakah, giving tzedakah, you could actually totally transform someone's hunger by giving tzedakah, for example. You can't get rid of it, but you could transform their experience in that moment with that gift. So I think if we think of it that way, I would see it less that God is deciding and then not deciding, or I'm not sure if I'm getting the question right, but I think what we understand is there's a lot that's not in our control, and even God is not pulling the strings. But the things we can control, it might not change the actual verdict, but it could change the way we see it or experience it.
So I love that. And I think it also gives the nuance more than it's sort of literal, like if you do this, or if you don't do this, this will happen. There was someone in our group, I don't want to name her just in case she doesn't want to be public about it, who said that she used language like this. I want to do something that pleases, I want to act in a way that pleases God. And I think that there is undeniably on these holidays, maybe I'll speak for myself, a sense that you do want to be judged well. You do want to have a sense that your behavior has been held to some standard, and maybe you don't have faith that there is a being, because it sounds very anthropomorphic to say that someone is judging in that sense. But I guess I want to ask you, is it so terrible to want to please something in a way, to feel like there is a judge, to feel like the stakes are kind of high for a holiday like this? Because going into it and saying, I've got God's love kind of no matter what I do, no matter how I've screwed up this year. It kind of takes a little bit of, I think, the urgency of some of what we're about to do out of it.
Listen, I love my children all the time, unconditionally. I'm not always pleased with them. So I think that aspiring to act in the world to please God is such a beautiful aspiration. And what I love about that is I think we all know in our guts, I think we know those things that would be pleasing to God. And let's say you don't even know that you're sure you believe in God. I'm totally fine with that. But ask yourself, what would you do and how would you behave to please a God if you believe there was one at all? My guess is that if you behaved in the world as if you were trying to please a being that cared about goodness, that cared about justice, that cared about compassion, that if you behaved in a way that you were trying to please a God like that, whether or not you believe, the world would be a better place and you would walk in the world in a better way if you just behave that way. I think about this a lot because a lot of people say, but I don't believe in God. And I actually care much less about whether or not someone believes in God as whether or not they act as if some force in the universe cares what they're doing. That they understand that there is actually a source of goodness. And I like that language, that we'd like to think we could please that source in some way.
And you've also, you've used the word trust. If you can, Emunah, I think, is something that you talked about in our interview. And again, we didn't have space for it in the text, but is that kind of along those lines, that how would you behave in the world if you trusted that there is a God?
I would say that the Hebrew word emunah, we often translate as faith, but I would say faith is like a noun. It's something you possess, meaning I have faith. And there's plenty of people who say, I don't have faith. It's something you can own or not own. I'd like for us to use the word trust, because that's actually a better translation of emunah, of faith, of trusting. And trusting is a verb. You are trusting in something, and you have to act in a way that is trusting. And it's less about what you're thinking in your head and whether or not you actually have faith. And instead, it's more about, I'm going to trust that things are going to get better tomorrow. I'm going to trust that someone loves me. I'm going to trust that I'm going to get through this really hard time. That's different than saying I have faith that God's going to take care of it. But if you behave in ways that are trusting, if you trust in God, that impacts the way we walk through the world and how we come through it.
And for those, and just because I know you and watched you very up close when I was lucky enough to be in leadership for a little while, you have death happening every day that you're dealing with in a way that I think very few of us confront. And a lot of those losses are really unimaginable, whether it's a child, in a terrible accident, whether it is a suicide of a child, whether, someone has lost someone already and then loses two more. And those people, I would say, maybe it's too simplistic, but I feel like we have to ask it, might feel a little less loved by God, or might feel God's love a little less, might question God's love. And I know that is just too literal a frame, but what is the pastoral language for that in terms of love?
Yeah, those are impossible times. And I will share that within 2 months of my becoming the senior rabbi at Central, there was the death of a young girl, 9 years old. She had been in my daughter Rosie's preschool class. I knew her really well. And she died on the last day of sleepaway camp, her first year away, and came completely out of the blue. And I remember that was maybe one of the moments where I felt the most shaken in my own sense of trusting how this could be possible, trusting that I had any idea how I could talk to this parent, the parents, when he called me. And I guess in some way I was led by this family. One of the first things that this father said to me when he was in the hospital room and he was lying with his child, who was not yet dead, but she was brain dead, but they were keeping her alive on ventilators. He said, because we want to be able to donate her organs so some part of her can continue to live on. And I just was so blown away that he could have this trust in like a life for her beyond her death that was so immediate in this moment of his deepest pain, that I have most often learned about God from the people that I have served in those moments of the deepest valleys.
It's incredible. We're going to go to questions soon, but I want to ask you also personally about singing, because I think for many of us, I'll speak for myself, but I know I speak for others, it's when you're singing especially that we sometimes feel something divine is channeled. It feels like you kind of go somewhere, but you're also not leaving us behind. And I think that spiritual language, I know, can get very, again, both personalized and frankly vague for people. So it's not that journalistic a question. It's sort of, I guess I'm saying I feel kind of God's love in the room when you are singing and also when you're speaking, but it's a more intellectual experience. So is what I'm kind of assuming happening to you, or are you, is that kind of not the moments where you're more privately connected to the divine, because ultimately you're giving something to the rest of us, you're working?
I am feeling God's love when I'm singing, and I feel it way more, like exponentially more when I'm singing with other people. It's like this exponential multiplication of some kind of divine energy when we sing together. It's probably the thing I've missed the most in the last 6 months. And I mean, I will say that I always felt that singing was somehow, and music was an expression of kind of something like a pure spirit. And when I was a kid, I was definitely a strange kind of kid, but I used to like sit on my swing set outside and sing songs to God. Like I would just say like, thank you for the birds and trees. And, you know, just like, it was sort of an expression.
Hey, Angela, you were not normal.
I know, I was definitely not normal. And I used to sing in the car all the time with my sister, and we'd sing in harmony, and my parents would like encourage that kind of thing. And I used to think it was like a funny thing that when you watch a musical on Broadway, it was always kind of funny that people are talking and then they break into song, and you're like, that doesn't happen in real life. But if you ever watch children before they've been shamed out of doing it, they do that all the time. Little kids just walk down the street and they're like, and then I see umbrellas and it's raining, you know, whatever. I was that kid, but I kind of never outgrew it. And I was lucky that my parents never made me feel embarrassed about it. So singing has always been some kind of pure connection for me. And then, as I said, when I sing with others, I don't know, science is starting to catch up with trying to understand why singing helps people feel so connected. When we breathe together, sing together, the resonances in our body, the resonances in the room, something is happening. But more than that, for me, when I look at people and I feel the energy that comes back, to me, that's as close as a feeling of like what God feels like to me as anything.
So Betty Robbins was in our group, and I know her well enough to think she would give me permission to ask this, but she was very challenging in the sense that she felt like it's solipsistic to talk in these terms of God loving me or me loving, or I love God. That's sort of a me-centric frame, and it's just not how it sort of works for her. How would you respond to that? Because as much as I relate to you, I also relate to her, saying that it just doesn't feel kind of like the way we come at the divine, us Jews.
Well, I just say that the commandment, maybe most important, that has been said in different ways, but I'll just say it this way, is love your neighbor as yourself. Well, let me ask you something. What if you don't really love yourself? How much can you love anyone else? And we all know that. We know people who don't have a sense of fullness of love. And I don't mean that loving yourself in that narcissistic, solipsistic way. Just feeling somehow at peace with who you are and feeling a sense that you are loved, that you are deserving of love. I think that creates the heart space to love others deeply and to love God and the creation of the world and creatures and other human beings. So I really do think that it has to begin with each one of us feeling that we deserve love and that we feel that and that we can love ourselves. That doesn't mean we think we're perfect. I'm an extremely big critic of myself. It's not that kind of love. It's just that you can, it's at the end of the day, you can say, I'm okay. I'm good enough. I deserve love. And we all should feel that. And I think that if we don't have that as the foundation, we're limited in how much we can actually give love.
That's great. And I'm riffing on a couple of the questions that have come through and sort of making it my own here. You just said sometimes it's hard to love ourselves, or we don't actually, which I think is true. Sometimes it's also hard to love the neighbor or know even what that would feel like. And you talked in our interview about loving action, which I thought was such a helpful kind of reframing of that. Because I could, as you said, sort of look more about how I'm treating someone and less whether I actually have an emotional feeling for my neighbor. Particularly in the pandemic, I just want you to address what that loving action might mean right now, because I think we're all seeing kind of writ large this sense of what it means to impact each other if we don't take care of each other.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to combine this question with the one you asked me right before, which is interesting. There's been a big attitude during this pandemic of people saying, don't trump on my liberties. I can do whatever I want with my own body. I don't want to wear a mask. If I'm not hurting you, it doesn't matter. Or if I want to go to this big motorcycle rally and I'm willing to get sick if I get sick, there's a sense that like, I can do what I want.
I just want to say your opinion's not coming through at all.
But there's a sense that that we're deciding that we're going to treat ourselves a certain way, which I might argue is not even particularly loving to ourselves. But what it does is ultimately there's no sense that what we're doing is treating what the impact is that it ends up being not loving to our neighbors in a sense as well, in that action of saying, I can do whatever I want with my own body, with my own space. And I guess I would say that there's a certain way that if there was more kind of care there, it would also impact. But I would also say that loving actions, yeah, it does mean that it's not just what exactly do I want to do in this moment, in this pandemic, but what will actually impact others. And in an era of a lot of racial unrest and kind of surfacing injustices that I think we've all seen but not been willing to look at, it's, loving actions include putting ourselves and being able to radically empathize with an experience that might not be our own, but we recognize is devastating for people. And so that to me is not just about feels like I have to love that person, meaning in my heart. It would be great if we do, but more than that, it's like, are we willing to actually see ourselves in their position? Are we willing to actually care for them and be compassionate and do the actions that care for people around us?
Great. Sarah, Rabbi Berman, I'm going to you to start bringing some of these questions in.
Great. So I'll start with a hard one, if you don't mind.
Oh, great.
And it actually
all been hard.
Another hard one. And it actually comes from both Marcia, our executive director, and Sanford. So what both of them are asking is actually in line with each other. Sanford talks about the message of Job, which you referenced earlier, is that we can't understand what is going on in our lives because the world and everything in it is so much bigger than anything we can understand. And Marcia's question, she says she loves the idea that God gives us not rules but guideposts to be our best selves, but she struggles with God allowing for so much suffering. And so I think her question underlying that and underlying Sanford's question is, where is the love in that?
Yeah. Okay, you're right. That's really hard. Um, it is so hard to reconcile the level of suffering we see around us and that we know exists in the world with an idea of a loving God. And I think what we have to, the way I understand it, is that God doesn't create this suffering. Even when you think about a tornado, which can, or we've had a lot of hurricanes recently, and we say, but that's an act of God. God like made this hurricane, which killed all these people. Actually, if a hurricane hit a place where we didn't actually build like tons and tons of buildings, it just hit a field, does no damage. In fact, it kind of lifts up the earth and probably does something good. These forest fires that are happening, some of them happen naturally. It's part of the regenerative process of a forest. We see it as evil because we've created a world in which suddenly it's not convenient to have that forest fire a mile away from us because that's next to my house. So we see it as evil, but it's not inherently evil. It is how the world operates. And I don't think that God is bringing that hurricane or that forest fire down on specific people to hurt people. It is just what it is. And so there is going to be suffering that happens both from natural acts as well as human evil acts. And that's the cause of a lot of suffering. My view is that a loving God is walking with us to eradicate some of the hunger, to alleviate some of the suffering, to have us be there holding someone's hand when they're suffering through an illness. It is the way that societies come together and rebuild after hurricanes and donate and volunteer. That is where I see God in all of those acts of people behaving in a way to please God, but not just to please God, but to help each other and to feel better about our role in the world. So I think that I do not see God causing all this suffering. I think God gives us the courage, the strength, the empathy, the compassion to alleviate some of that suffering we see around us.
Thank you. Wow. So then another pair of questions. Debbie says that trust sounds more active, whereas faith sounds more passive to her. The relationship that she has with God is not about expecting God to react for her, or not expecting God to react, but for her to act in a way that shows moral values that live inside her. And it sounds like that's where God exists, inside of her. Which is right in line with what Mitchell is asking about a God who's not separate from us, but running through us, like the Echad, the oneness in the Shema. And his question, I think, encapsulates both of these, which is, where does a non-dualistic notion fit in?
What do you mean? What do you mean by a non-dualistic? Like not like good and evil?
Yeah, I think that's what's in this question.
I think that I deeply believe that God resides everywhere. So in each human being, in each creature, in a leaf, in a rock, I think that God really does exist, is possibly existing in all of that. And so I guess I'm not ascribing that sense of like good and evil. And I think that we frame a lot of things as good and evil when oftentimes they are just flip sides of the same coin in extreme. We talk about the fact that we have a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer Tov, which is the evil inclination and a good inclination. And the interesting thing is, people say, well, why doesn't God get rid of the evil inclination that we all have in us? And it says the world wouldn't even exist if we didn't have a Yetzer Hara, because in the extreme, obviously, it's horrible. But without ambition, competition, lust, these things that are part of our evil inclination, we wouldn't kind of create and build and make families and all of these things. This is at least the way the rabbis frame it. The understanding is it's not an inherent evil. It's oftentimes the way it functions in the world. And so I don't see God as dualistic, like good and evil. I think that there just is. And part of our job is to understand how we see things and detach from some of the impact of it and understand it in a different way so that it doesn't feel as evil. I don't know if I'm answering that exactly the way I wanted to say it, but
yeah.
I think you are, and also maybe not enough for everybody. Ellen wants to poke at you a little bit.
Okay.
And she asks explicitly, how do you reconcile the idea of a loving God with the amount of hatred in the world today, and even more, the increased acceptability of expressing hatred today?
So it's so painful to me, and this is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but I am going to say I do think that the reduction in the level of sort of people being in community, and not just religious community, because some religions can be corrupting, but I mean, I think good community has created more kind of lonely people who are much more angry, and there's much more hatred. So I do think that like religious ritual and spiritual communities have actually been a foundation for helping create more loving communities and people. But more than that, I think that, listen, we do not want God to control our thinking. And a decision that was made a whole long time ago, expressed in the story of the Garden of Eden, where we ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is that we were going to have free will. And if we're going to have free will, and God's not just controlling us with puppet strings, then that means that human beings have capacity for tremendous evil. And it's painful to see it. And I believe that God is crying and weeping at the way the world looks right now and the amount of hatred and polarization that exists. But the flip side, which is that God would actually get rid of evil or make sure that nobody said anything or did anything hateful, would mean that we would just become puppets of God, and there would be no morality. We live in a world without morality, and there's only morality when there's a choice. Unfortunately, too many people are making a hateful choice, and we've got to put a little bit more God in the world to fix that.
And I think that actually takes us directly to what will be the last question. And this comes from Harriet, which is, what is the relationship between faith and conscience? And I would add to that, and love. Don't they intertwine, faith and conscience and love?
Conscience being like your good inclination?
Yeah.
I deeply believe that we're all born with an inner moral compass, an inner sense of what it is to be loved. You don't have to teach a baby to love. They open up their eyes, they look at the person who's taking care of them, they just love. They don't have to be taught to do that. Why is that? And I think that we fundamentally are born with a conscience, with an ability to love, with a sense of faith that the world is good. You just look into a baby's eyes and you know that they wake up and they thought the world was good. And unfortunately, there can be so much pain in the world that people can be corrupted out of that and shamed out of that, or hurt enough that they don't believe in it. But I think we're all born with that. And to me, that inherent love, that loving instinct, and that sense of our own moral compass, that to me is the divine spark that's in every person. And we are all born that way. And our texts say that we're all born with that pure soul. So here's the thing. So many things in our lives hurt us, make us perhaps a little bit cynical. Maybe we've been burned or scarred or even abused. And those things, they kind of chip away at our feeling of being loved, and perhaps they question our moral compass. But what I would say is all of us at any time can return to that initial goodness and pure soul and love and godliness that we were born with, and that God welcomes that return at every moment, but especially at this season.
That's a perfect note to end on. I just want to say that, as I listen to you, I do think without exaggerating that for those of us who struggle, and I think I'll speak for the team here, that all of us have moments of great doubt, or a feeling of being sort of lost, and not necessarily having that sort of larger caretaker that, whether it's anthropomorphic or not, is so much a part of, I think, the Jewish language of God, and that you and your team of clergy, I think, help us, as you said, that God walks with us. I think you're walking with us even more on a daily basis to kind of help us, if not feel loved, feel understood, and cared for. So I'm just taking an opportunity before we pound our chests and focus on how terrible we all are, to say thank you for what you're about to take us through as we self-flagellate in the new year.
Well, thank you. I have to say that I've learned the most and felt the most of God's love being in this community. It's really where I learn it every day. And these holidays will be very hard to not actually be getting that immediate feedback, and that us all singing in the room and feeling the God of all of that. But I know that we're going to find it in different ways. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here and gathering tonight, and I look forward to seeing you virtually again in a couple of weeks.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
We will see you all next week for our final conversation with Rabbi Nicole Auerbach. Thank you so much for being here. Good night.
Thank you.